You think you're in control, but your mind is running you. You checked your phone this morning without deciding to, and you didn't even notice it. When was the last time you made a decision, and only later realized it wasn't really yours? You said something in a conversation and regretted it before the other person even responded. You told yourself last week that things would be different, and then, almost without noticing, you repeated the exact same pattern you promised yourself you would leave behind. And the strangest part of all this, it felt like you were in control the entire time. That feeling is convincing. It feels like proof. When you act, it feels chosen. When you speak, it feels intentional. When you decide, it feels like it came from you. But what if that feeling is not proof of control? What if it is simply what control is supposed to feel like, whether it is real or not? This is not a comfortable question, and it is not meant to be, because the people who never ask it continue living in a loop they cannot see, reacting and calling it choosing, repeating and calling it personality, following patterns they never selected and calling it identity. Epictetus opened the Enchiridion, his foundational manual on how to live, not with wisdom, not with comfort, but with a division. He said there are things that depend on us and things that do not, and almost everything most people spend their lives trying to control falls into the second category. Not because life is unfair, because the control was never where they were looking for it. This video is about that, about the gap between the control you feel and the control you actually have, about why your mind moves before you do, and what that means for every decision you think you are making, about where the real possibility of agency lives and why most people never find it, not because they are not trying, but because they are looking in the wrong direction entirely. You are not here to be told that you are broken. You are not here to be fixed. You are here because something in you already suspects that the version of control you have been living with is not the whole story. And that suspicion is worth following. The illusion that feels like certainty. There is a specific kind of certainty that never announces itself. It does not arrive with doubt. It does not come with hesitation. It simply settles inside you, quietly, like a foundation you never had to build because it was already there when you arrived. You do not believe you are in control of your life. You know it. And that knowing feels as natural as breathing, as obvious as gravity, as solid as anything you have ever been sure of. That is exactly what makes it so difficult to question. The illusion of control does not look fragile. It does not feel like an illusion at all. It feels like clarity. When you make a decision, the decision feels like it came from you. When you react to something, the reaction feels like a choice. When you explain your behavior, the explanation feels accurate, reasonable, completely aligned with who you believe yourself to be. There is no alarm that goes off. There is no internal signal that says, wait, something here is not what it appears to be. And because there is no signal, there is no pause. And because there is no pause, the pattern continues, confirmed by every action that follows it. This is the part that Epictetus understood before almost anyone else put it into clear language. In the Enchiridion, he does not begin by telling you what you should control. He begins by dismantling what you already think you control. He draws the line first, before offering anything else, because he knew that building wisdom on top of a false foundation does not produce wisdom. It produces a more sophisticated version of the same confusion. Here is the thing about certainty. It functions as its own proof. The more certain you are, the less you examine. The less you examine, the more the certainty is reinforced. It is a closed loop. It never asks to be revisited. It never creates the kind of friction that would invite a second look. And so you move through your days feeling in control, while patterns you never consciously chose continue to operate beneath that feeling, producing results you sometimes cannot explain, reactions you later regret, decisions that, when you look at them honestly, seem to have come from somewhere other than the deliberate, aware person you believe yourself to be. This is not a character flaw. This is not a sign that something is wrong with you specifically. This is the default condition of a mind that has never been shown where to look. The question is not whether you have been running on this kind of automatic certainty. You have. Everyone has. The question is whether you are willing to stay with the discomfort of examining it, because that examination is where everything in this conversation begins. And if the certainty of control is already this difficult to question, wait until you discover what is actually generating it. You narrate what already happened. There is a function in your mind that almost no one teaches you to recognize, not because it is hidden and not because it is complicated, but because it is so constant, so seamlessly woven into the fabric of how you experience yourself that it becomes invisible through repetition. This function does not act. It explains. It arrives after the fact, after the reaction, after the word was already spoken, after the choice was already made, and it constructs a story that sounds exactly like the beginning. A story that says, I did this because. I said that because. I chose this direction because. And the story is coherent, it is reasonable. It carries the tone of someone who was present and deliberate throughout the entire process. But the story came second. The action came first. You react to something, and then a voice inside you says, I decided to respond that way because the situation called for it. You avoid something, and that same voice says, I chose not to go because it did not make sense for me right now. You change your mind about something, and it says, after thinking it through more carefully, I realized that a different approach was better. That voice is not lying to you. It is doing precisely what it was built to do. It is creating coherence. It is taking what happened and arranging it into a sequence that feels intentional. It is transforming reaction into reasoning, impulse into rationale, and it is doing this so quickly, so smoothly, that by the time you hear the explanation, it already feels like the cause rather than the commentary. Behavioral neuroscience has documented this pattern extensively. The brain generates what researchers call post hoc justifications, explanations that are constructed after the action, not before it. What you experience as your reason for doing something is frequently a narrative your mind assembled so that everything would make sense in retrospect. Not because you are dishonest, because that is how the architecture works. And this matters more than it might seem at first, because if you are narrating actions that already happened, if the explanation comes after the event and not before it, then the voice you trust most as evidence of your own agency may be the least reliable guide to what is actually driving your behavior. Think about that for a moment. The most convincing proof you have that you are in control is a story your mind tells you after the fact. That is not control. That is narration wearing the costume of control. And if narration is not origin, if the explanation is a translation rather than the source, then something else initiated the action before you arrived to describe it. Something moved first, and that something is worth understanding because it is closer to the actual steering mechanism than the story that followed. The author who isn't writing. You think of yourself as the author of your life. That is not an unusual thing to believe. It is perhaps the most natural self-concept a person can have. You are the one living it, experiencing it, making decisions inside it. Of course you are the author. Of course the story is yours. But consider what actually happens in the moments that catch you off guard. Not the moments you planned, not the conversations you prepared for, or the responses you rehearsed, or the situations where you had time to think before speaking. Consider the moments that arrived without announcement, a sharp comment from someone you trusted, a silence that carried more weight than any words could have, a message that arrived at exactly the wrong time, in exactly the wrong tone, and something inside you moved before your mind could form a single coherent sentence. What came out of you in that moment was not chosen. It came before any choice was available. And then, a few seconds later, the narration arrived. The explanation. The author stepped in and said, "I reacted that way because I was under pressure, because what they said was unfair, because the situation left me no other option." But the author did not write that scene. The author showed up to describe it after it was already over. Marcus Aurelius wrote to himself in the Meditations in Book 2 in a passage that is easy to read quickly and far harder to sit with slowly. You have power over your mind, not over external events. Most people hear this and feel reassured. What Marcus Aurelius was actually pointing toward is far more demanding than reassurance. He understood that having power over the mind requires first acknowledging that the mind acts on its own when you are not present to it. The power is not automatic. It is not guaranteed by the fact that you exist and think and consider yourself a conscious person. It has to be exercised in real time, in the actual moment, before the reaction has already completed itself. And here is the part most people skip over. If you only arrive after the scene is written, if you only exercise your authorship in the explanation rather than in the action, then you are not the author. You are the editor. You are working with drafts you did not write, revising them into a shape that feels like yours, and calling that revision the original creative act. This is not a comfortable thing to sit with, but comfort is not what this moment requires, because if you are editing drafts you did not write, the next question is not about technique or strategy, or how to become a better editor. The next question is about who or what is writing the drafts in the first place, and the answer to that question leads somewhere that most people spend their entire lives successfully avoiding. The self that watches and the self that acts. There is a division inside you that almost no one names directly, not because it is too abstract to describe, but because naming it clearly means accepting something that the mind instinctively resists. There is a part of you that acts, that speaks, reacts, chooses, or at least appears to choose, that moves through the world and generates consequences and calls itself by your name. And there is a part of you that watches, that notices, that sometimes hours or even days after something happened, says quietly, "Why did I do that? That was not what I wanted. That did not feel like me." These two parts are not the same, and the gap between them is where some of the most important questions about your life actually live. Carl Jung described this as a fundamental tension within the psyche. The ego, the part of you that believes it is in command, that carries your name and your history and your self-concept, is not the center of what you are. It is a relatively small and relatively recent layer sitting on top of something far larger, far older, and far less subject to your conscious direction. The psyche does not wait for the ego to approve its movements. It moves. And the ego, more often than not, arrives afterward to take credit or assign blame. This is not a flaw in the design. This is the design. And here is the part that tends to land differently than any abstract description. You have almost certainly had this experience yourself. You have looked at your own behavior and thought, "That is not really me. That is not the version of me I recognize as true." And yet in that moment that was exactly what came out of you, not the version you would have chosen, not the response that aligned with the person you believe yourself to be. And then you did it again, not because you forgot your intention, not because you stopped caring, but because the part of you that acted and the part of you that observes are not yet in the kind of relationship where the observer has any real influence over the actor before the action is already complete. Most people live their entire lives in this gap without ever naming it. The actor moves, the observer watches. And somewhere in between, a story gets told that makes it all seem like one continuous, coherent, intentional self. But if the actor and the observer are not the same, and if the observer consistently arrives too late to change what the actor already did, then the question of control becomes far more specific than it usually gets asked. It is not, "Do I have control?" It is, Which part of me would need to be in control for that word to mean something real? And does that part currently have any say in what happens before the moment has already passed? What you call me is mostly inherited. You have opinions that feel deeply yours, values that feel like they came from somewhere inside you, considered and chosen and genuinely held. Reactions that feel like authentic expressions of who you are. A way of seeing the world that feels, above all else, like it belongs to you specifically, like it could not have been anyone else's, because it fits so precisely the person you know yourself to be. But here is the question that almost no one asks with real seriousness: where did that person come from? Not philosophically, not abstractly, concretely. Where did the specific set of responses, the specific emotional triggers, the specific things that feel obvious and natural and right to you, where did those actually originate? Because the honest answer, when you follow it all the way back, is not a moment of personal deliberation. It is not a series of conscious choices made by a younger version of you who examined the available options and selected the ones that made the most sense. The honest answer is absorption. Most of what you call identity was not chosen. It was accumulated. Patterns observed in people around you so early that you had no language to evaluate them, only the capacity to internalize them. Emotional responses repeated so many times in childhood that they became reflexes before you were old enough to ask whether they were useful. Beliefs about yourself, about other people, about what is safe and what is dangerous and what you deserve and what is possible. Beliefs that were never formally taught but were demonstrated constantly by everything around you, until they became the water you swam in without noticing it was water. Seneca wrote to his friend Lucilius in the Letters to Lucilius, Letter 1, with a clarity that has not aged at all. Reclaim yourself for yourself, not as a philosophical gesture, as an urgent practical instruction to someone who had just begun to notice how much of his time, his attention, and his inner life was being given away without examination. And in a later letter, he pressed further, asking his friend to examine whether the opinions he held with the most conviction were actually his own, or whether they were simply the ones he had never thought to question. He was not suggesting that inherited values are necessarily wrong. He was pointing to something more precise. The values you defend with the most energy are frequently the ones you examined the least, because they arrived before you had the tools to examine anything. This is where the discomfort of this topic tends to concentrate, because it is one thing to acknowledge that you were shaped by your environment. Almost everyone can accept that in a general way. It is another thing entirely to look at a specific reaction, a specific belief, a specific way you treat yourself or other people, and ask honestly, did I choose this? Or did I inherit a system of responses to the world and then spend years experiencing that system as my authentic self? The feeling of being yourself is real, the feeling is genuine, but the feeling of being yourself is not the same as having chosen who you are. And the difference between those two things is not small. Because if the values generating your reactions were never consciously selected, then the reactions themselves are not really coming from you in the way you assumed they were. They are coming from a version of you that was assembled by everything that happened before you had any say in the matter. And that version, as familiar as it feels, is not the whole story of what you could be. The thought you didn't invite. Here is something that happens to every person alive, every single day, and that almost no one stops to examine with any real attention. A thought appears. You did not summon it. You did not sit down and decide to think it. You did not prepare the ground for it or invite it in. It simply arrived, fully formed, with its own tone and its own weight and its own particular flavor of urgency or discomfort or longing. And now it is there, occupying space inside you, as if it had every right to be. And you call this thinking. But thinking implies agency. Thinking implies that someone is performing the act, that there is a thinker behind the thought, present and deliberate, generating the content from a place of conscious intention. And if the thought arrived before you could do anything about it, before you even registered that something was about to appear, then the question becomes genuinely uncomfortable. Who thought it? Epictetus made a distinction in his teaching that sounds simple when you first encounter it, and quietly dismantles a great deal of your assumptions about yourself when you actually sit with it. He separated what appears in the mind from what you do with what appears. The first, he said, is not yours. The second can be. The impression, the thought, the image, the impulse that arises without your permission, that is not something you are responsible for generating. But your response to it, the step you take after it arrives, that is where your actual agency lives if you know how to find it. The problem is that most people never reach the second part, because by the time the thought has appeared, they are already inside it, not observing it, not relating to it from any kind of distance. Inside it, moving with it, following it wherever it leads, and experiencing the entire process as if they had chosen to go there. You have almost certainly experienced a version of this that you remember clearly. A thought arrived that you knew, even in the moment, was not taking you anywhere useful. A thought about a past situation that could not be changed. A worry about a future event that had not happened and might never happen. A story about what someone else was thinking or intending or feeling toward you. You knew somewhere in yourself that continuing to follow this thought was not serving you, and you followed it anyway for minutes, sometimes for hours, and only afterward did you surface and think, why did I spend that much time there? Not because you lacked intelligence, not because you did not care about your own well-being, but because no one ever showed you clearly that the moment the thought arrived was not the moment you were committed to its consequences. That there is a point, very early, very brief, where you can relate to the thought rather than merge with it, where you can notice it without becoming it. That point exists. It is real. But it requires a kind of attention that is almost never taught, and that the automatic functioning of the mind has no interest in developing on your behalf. Because the mind is not trying to serve your highest intentions. It is trying to maintain continuity. And continuity means following the thought that arrived, the same way it followed the last one, and the one before that. In the same direction it has always gone. The question is not whether you can stop thoughts from arriving. You cannot. The question is whether you can develop enough presence to notice the arrival before you are already 3 steps into following it, somewhere you did not consciously choose to go. The gap nobody talks about. Between the thought that appears and the action that follows, there is a gap. It is not a large gap. In most moments it is so brief that it seems to not exist at all. The thought arrives, the emotion rises, the action follows, and the whole sequence feels like a single movement, like one continuous event with no internal divisions, no pauses, no space where anything else could have happened. But the gap is there. It has always been there. And everything that matters about the question of real agency either happens inside it or does not happen at all. Viktor Frankl, a psychiatrist who survived the Nazi concentration camps and spent the rest of his life thinking carefully about what makes human beings free, said that between stimulus and response there is a space. And in that space lies the freedom and the power to choose our response. He was not speaking poetically. He was not reaching for a comforting idea. He was describing something he had observed under conditions so extreme that almost everything else a person believes about themselves gets stripped away, and what remains is either real or it is nothing. He found that the space was real. He found that even when everything external had been taken, the space between what happened and how a person responded to it could still exist, could still be inhabited, could still be the location of something that deserved to be called a human choice. But here is what rarely gets said about that space in the conversations that follow Frankl's insight. The space does not announce itself. It does not grow larger on its own. It does not become more accessible simply because you have heard that it exists and now believe it is there. It has to be perceived, in real time, in the middle of a reaction that already feels inevitable. In the precise moment when emotion is rising and the familiar response is already loading itself, and everything in your system is pointed toward the same outcome it always produces. Perceiving something that lasts a fraction of a second in the middle of an experience that feels like it has its own momentum, that requires a quality of attention that is not automatic. It is not the attention you use to navigate traffic or follow a conversation or solve a problem at work. It is something more interior, more subtle, more directed toward the movement inside you rather than the events happening around you. And this is the part that most approaches to self-improvement quietly skip over. They tell you that the space exists. They tell you that you have a choice. They tell you that you are not your reactions. And then they move on, as if naming the space were the same as giving you access to it. It is not. Knowing the space is there does not mean you can inhabit it when it matters most, when the emotion is already moving, when the familiar story has already started, when every previous version of this situation ended the same way, and your nervous system sees no reason to expect anything different this time. The space exists. That part is true, but the path to it is not through more information. It is not through more intention. It is not through wanting it hard enough. It is through the gradual development of a different quality of inner attention, an attention that has been turned inward consistently enough that when the gap appears, you are already oriented in the right direction to notice it before it closes. And that kind of attention does not develop by accident, which means the question is not whether the gap is real. The question is what you are currently doing with the attention that could reach it, and whether that is enough. Emotion is not the enemy. You have probably heard in some form or another that you need to control your emotions, that they are the disruptive element, the force that clouds judgment and leads to decisions you later regret, that the ideal state is one of clear, undisturbed reason, operating without the interference of what you feel, that the goal is to feel less or to feel only after the thinking is done, or to place emotions somewhere below reason in a reliable hierarchy where the right faculty is always in charge. This is one of the most widespread misreadings of Stoic philosophy, and it has caused a considerable amount of quiet damage to people who tried to apply it sincerely. The Stoics were not against emotion. They were against subservience to emotion. That distinction is not subtle. It is the entire point. In the Stoic tradition, there was a careful and important separation between what they called the passions, emotional states that arise from false judgments and disturb the capacity for clear thinking, and what they called the eupatheiai, which translates roughly as good emotions, responses that emerge naturally from a well-ordered character and do not distort perception. Joy, as distinct from pleasure-seeking. Caution, as distinct from fear. Wishing well, as distinct from desperate wanting. The Stoics were not describing a life emptied of feeling. They were describing a life in which feeling had been brought into alignment with understanding. Emotion is not the enemy. Emotion that commands before it has been examined is. Marcus Aurelius, in the Meditations, does not read like a man who felt nothing. He reads like a man who felt everything and made a practice of examining what he felt before deciding what to do with it. The practice was not suppression. It was inquiry. It was the habit of pausing long enough to ask, is this feeling showing me something true, or is it showing me something I have believed so long that it feels true? There is a version of this that most people have experienced and rarely talk about. You felt something very strong, anger, fear, shame, the particular sting of feeling unseen or dismissed, and somewhere inside you, even in that moment, You knew that you were about to act from that feeling rather than from any considered position. You knew it, and you acted anyway. Not because the feeling was too powerful to resist in any absolute sense, but because no one had ever clearly shown you the difference between feeling something and being obligated to obey it. That difference is where everything changes. Feeling is information. It is your system responding to what it perceives, flagging something as significant, drawing your attention towards something it has assessed as relevant. That assessment may be accurate. It may also be a pattern from 15 years ago, responding to a present situation that only superficially resembles the original one. Feeling does not tell you which of those is happening. Examination does. The question is not, how do I stop feeling this? The question is this feeling a signal worth following, or is it a command I have never thought to question? And the gap between those two framings is not small. In one, you are a person responding to information. In the other, you are a person being moved by a force you never agreed to obey. The stories that run faster than thought. Before any strong emotion arrives, something else was already there. You do not feel anger at an event. You feel anger at an interpretation. You do not feel fear of a situation. You feel fear of a meaning your mind assigned to that situation in a fraction of a second, before any conscious evaluation was possible, before you had any chance to ask whether the meaning was accurate. Someone does not reply to your message. Before you have consciously registered what happened, your mind has already produced a story. They are ignoring you deliberately. You said something that pushed them away. They have decided you are not worth their time. The story arrives with the tone of fact. It carries the weight of evidence. And the emotion follows the story, not the event, as if the interpretation were reality and the reality were simply a detail. This is what Epictetus was pointing at in the Enchiridion, in the passage that has been translated and cited and repeated more than almost anything else in Stoic literature, precisely because it is so difficult to genuinely absorb. He wrote that people are not disturbed by events, but by the opinions they hold about events. Not the circumstances, the interpretation of the circumstances. He was not making a case for denial. He was not suggesting that difficult things are not difficult, or that pain is not real. He was identifying the precise location where human suffering most often originates, and it is not in the event itself. It is in the story the mind wraps around the event before the person even has time to see what actually happened. The problem with these stories is not that they exist. The mind cannot function without interpretation. It cannot encounter raw, meaningless experience and leave it unorganized. It is built to make meaning constantly, automatically, faster than any deliberate thought process could ever operate. The problem is that the stories arrive as facts. They do not feel like interpretations. They do not feel like one possible reading among several. They feel like accurate reports of reality, delivered by a reliable source, carrying the full weight of what is true. And so you respond to the story as if it were the event. You feel the emotion the story generated, as if the emotion were a direct response to what happened. And you act from that emotion as if the entire sequence were a straightforward encounter with the world as it actually is. You have almost certainly had this experience in a form you can recognize immediately. You were upset, genuinely upset about something, carrying real weight about it, turning it over, feeling the edges of it throughout your day, and then you described it to someone else out loud in actual words, and as you heard yourself speaking, something shifted. It sounded different outside your head. It sounded smaller, not because the feeling was not real, but because putting it into words, into a linear sequence that someone else could hear, forced the story out of the compressed, emotionally charged form it had been living in inside you, and into a shape that could be examined. That shift is not accidental. That is what happens when a story that has been running as reality gets treated, even briefly, as a story. And if that shift is possible after the fact, in a conversation with someone else, then the same shift is potentially available before the fact, in the moment the story first arrives. Not every time, not perfectly, but with enough inner attention to notice that what just appeared in your mind is an interpretation, and that interpretations can be examined before they are obeyed. The cost of running on default. There is a price for living on automatic. It does not arrive all at once, in a form you can clearly identify and respond to. It arrives in small installments, spread across months and years, quiet enough that each individual payment seems like nothing, accumulated into something significant enough to change the shape of an entire life. A decision you did not consciously make, that sent you down a path you would not have chosen if you had been fully present to the choice. A relationship that followed a pattern you had lived before, in different circumstances with different people, and that ended in a way that felt familiar, in a way you could not quite explain. A reaction that cost you something important, a connection, an opportunity, a version of yourself you valued, and that when you tried to account for it honestly hours later, you could not fully explain even to yourself. This is not failure. This is not weakness. This is what happens when the default system operates without supervision, when the patterns that were laid down early continue running without anyone examining whether they still serve the person you are now, whether they were ever really serving you, or whether they simply arrived first and stayed because nothing ever interrupted them long enough to ask whether they belonged. Seneca wrote to Lucilius in the Letters to Lucilius, Letter 1, something that sounds almost impatient with urgency. Vindica te tibi, reclaim yourself for yourself. In Latin, the word he used for reclaim carries the weight of something that was taken or that was lost through inattention, and that now requires active effort to recover. He was not writing to someone who had dramatically failed. He was writing to someone who had simply been living the way most people live, giving time and attention away without tracking where it went, and only now beginning to notice the cost. The automatic is not neutral. That is the part most people miss when they think about habit and pattern and default behavior. It feels neutral because it is familiar. It feels like simply the way things are because it has been the way things have been for long enough that the alternative is difficult to imagine. But the automatic has a direction. It was established by everything you absorbed before you had the capacity to evaluate what you were absorbing. And it has been moving in that direction ever since, producing results that are entirely predictable once you understand the mechanism. Even when those results feel surprising in the moment, you make a decision. And somewhere underneath the feeling of deciding, a pattern that predates the decision by years or decades has already inclined the outcome in a particular direction. You call it your choice. In a limited sense it is. But the range of choices that felt available, the options that even occurred to you as possibilities, the emotional weight attached to each of them, all of that was shaped before you arrived at the moment of deciding. Here is what tends to land most directly when someone really allows this to settle. When you look back at the significant decisions of your life, not the trivial ones, but the ones that actually mattered, do they seem, in retrospect, like the expressions of a free and deliberate self? Or do they seem, if you are honest, like variations on a smaller number of themes than you would have expected? Like a person who genuinely believed they were choosing, while something underneath the choosing was maintaining a consistency that the conscious self never quite managed to override. That consistency has a name. Recognizing it is not the same as being defeated by it. Recognizing it is the first movement that is genuinely yours. But recognition alone does not change anything. And that is precisely what the next part of this conversation is going to ask you to look at directly. Why seeing clearly feels dangerous. There is a particular kind of avoidance that does not look like avoidance. It does not feel like running away. It feels like being practical, like prioritizing what matters, like not getting lost in overthinking when there are real things to attend to in the real world. But underneath that practicality, if you follow it far enough, there is often something more specific happening, something that has less to do with time or priorities and more to do with what you would have to do with the answer if you actually found it. Clarity has a cost, and the mind, which is extraordinarily efficient at protecting its own continuity, has learned to keep that cost just visible enough to discourage the inquiry. Here is what the cost actually is. If you see clearly how a specific pattern operates in you, you cannot unsee it. If you trace a reaction back to its actual origin, back to the belief or the early experience or the story that has been generating it for years, you cannot then return to the position of someone who does not know that. The knowledge creates responsibility, and responsibility requires movement, not dramatic movement, not an immediate overhaul of everything, but movement nonetheless. The small, consistent, uncomfortable movement of a person who has seen something true and is now accountable to that truth. This is why the mind resists genuine self-perception, not out of malice, out of a kind of energetic conservatism. It is metabolically expensive to process the discomfort of a real revision. It is far cheaper to maintain the existing pattern, to keep the familiar story running, to continue in the direction that has already been established. The path of least resistance is not laziness. It is biology. It is the system doing exactly what systems do, which is preserve themselves. Marcus Aurelius returned to the same themes in the Meditations again and again, not because he was forgetful, but because he understood something that is easy to underestimate. Clarity is not a destination. It is not a level you reach and then maintain without further effort. It is a practice that has to be renewed. The fog returns. The familiar distortions reassert themselves. The comfortable story about who you are and why you do what you do quietly reinstalls itself if you stop examining it long enough. He wrote to himself in the Meditations, Book 2, paragraph 4, words that were not meant for an audience, but for a man who knew how easily he could drift back into automatism even after he had seen through it. Begin the morning by saying to yourself, I shall meet with meddling, ungrateful, violent, treacherous, envious, uncharitable people. He was not being pessimistic. He was practicing the kind of preemptive clarity that keeps a person oriented before the day's friction has a chance to trigger the default response. The discomfort of seeing clearly is not a sign that something is wrong with what you are seeing. It is almost always a sign that you are getting close to something real. The mind does not resist comfortable truths. It resists the ones that would require it to change. And here is what makes this particular moment in the conversation important. You have now heard enough to have a choice. Not a dramatic choice, a quiet one. The choice between letting this settle into understanding and then gradually dissolving back into the familiar, or staying with the discomfort long enough to let it do something. Long enough to ask not just whether this is true in general, but where specifically, in your specific life, in your specific patterns, the automatic has been running without your genuine participation. That question is not comfortable, but it is the only question that leads anywhere worth going. And if clarity is this difficult to sustain even when you want it, what is it that allows some people to keep returning to it while others consistently find reasons to move on? The moment before the moment. There is an instant that precedes every reaction you have ever had. Not the thought, not the emotion, not the story that arrives with its familiar weight and direction. Something that comes before all of those, so early in the sequence that it barely registers as an experience at all. It is the moment before the moment, the fraction of a second in which something in your environment reaches you before any word has formed, before any interpretation has been applied, before any of the familiar machinery has had time to engage. A microstate, a shift so brief and so subtle that most people live their entire lives without ever directly perceiving it. even though it is happening constantly, even though it is, in a very real sense, the place where every reaction originates. Psychology describes this as the primary appraisal, the instantaneous preconscious evaluation that your nervous system performs the moment it registers something in the environment. Before you have thought anything, your system has already assessed, is this safe or threatening? Is this familiar or new? Is this something to move toward or away from? That assessment happens faster than conscious awareness can follow, and it inclines everything that comes after it, the emotion, the story, the action, in a direction that was set before you had any say in the matter. You cannot control the primary appraisal. That is important to understand clearly, because a great deal of suffering comes from people trying to control things at the level where control is simply not available. The initial response of your nervous system to the world is not a character flaw. It is not something you failed to manage. It is a biological function operating at a speed that consciousness cannot match. But what happens after that first instant, that is a different territory. The question is whether you can develop enough inner attention to perceive the movement that begins at that first moment, before it has fully become an emotion, before the story has taken hold, before the familiar response has assembled itself into the shape it always takes. Not to stop it, not to override it through force of will, but to be present enough to it that you have some relationship with what is happening inside you before it has already determined what you are going to do next. This is not a skill that arrives through intention alone. You cannot decide to perceive something that's subtle and simply begin perceiving it because you chose to. It requires a quality of inner attention that has to be cultivated over time through practice that is quiet and consistent and entirely unspectacular, through the repeated act of turning attention inward in the small moments when there is no crisis, so that the capacity is there in the large moments when everything is moving fast. You have felt the absence of this capacity in moments you probably remember, the moment when you could feel a reaction building and knew, somewhere in yourself, that it was about to take you somewhere familiar, somewhere you had been before and had not wanted to go, and yet you could not find the place inside you where you could stand apart from it and make a different choice. Not because the choice did not exist in theory, but because by the time you were aware of what was happening, the movement was already too far along, the momentum was already too established, and the familiar ending was already in progress. That is the experience of someone who has not yet learned to inhabit the moment before the moment. And when you begin to inhabit it, even partially, even imperfectly, even in a small number of situations before you lose access to it again, something shifts that cannot be fully described, but that anyone who has experienced it will recognize immediately. The reaction does not disappear, the impulse does not vanish, but there is suddenly a small amount of space between you and it, a small but real distance between the stimulus and your response, and in that distance, something that deserves to be called choice becomes briefly, genuinely available. That is not the end of the work. It is the beginning of the only work that actually matters in this conversation, because when you discover that the control was never where you were looking for it, you are finally standing in the right place to look for where it actually is. Control was never what you thought it was. Everything in this conversation has been moving toward this point, and this point is not a comfortable arrival. It is a dismantling. But what gets built in the place of what is dismantled is something considerably more solid than what was there before. The control you have been pursuing, in some form or another, for most of your adult life, the control over outcomes, over how other people respond to you, over what happens next, over whether things go the way you need them to go, that control never existed the way you imagined it did. And the effort you have invested in pursuing it has not been wasted exactly, but it has been directed at something that was never fully available which means a significant portion of that energy has been spent on a project that could not, by its nature, be completed. Epictetus opens the Enchiridion, his foundational guide to Stoic practice, with the distinction that is so simple it is easy to read past it, and so precise that it reorganizes everything when you actually let it land. He writes that some things are within our power and some things are not. Within our power are opinion, motivation, desire, aversion, and in a word, whatever is of our own doing. Not within our power are our body, our property, reputation, office, and in a word, whatever is not of our own doing. He was not making a passive argument. He was not telling you to accept whatever happens and call it peace. He was doing something far more demanding. He was asking you to identify with surgical precision where your actual agency ends, and to stop spending energy beyond that boundary as if spending it there were possible. Because the suffering that comes from trying to control what cannot be controlled is not a sign of caring too much. It is a sign of looking in the wrong direction. And looking in the wrong direction, with great effort and great sincerity, produces only exhaustion. The Stoic position is not that you are powerless. It is that your power has a specific address, and most people have never lived there with any consistency, because they were always out looking for it somewhere it does not exist. That address is your relationship with what happens. Not what happens. Your relationship with it. You cannot control the thought that arrives in your mind, but you can develop enough presence to notice it before you are obligated to obey it. You cannot control how another person treats you, but you can determine what that treatment is going to mean to you, what story you will build around it, what it will cost you or teach you or reveal to you. You cannot control the outcome of most things you care deeply about, but you can control the quality of attention and intention you bring to the actions that are genuinely within your reach. This is not resignation. Resignation is a kind of giving up that still carries the resentment of having wanted something different. What Epictetus was describing is something else entirely. It is the freedom that comes from precision, from knowing exactly where your power is real and directing everything toward that place, rather than scattering it across a territory that was never yours to govern. And here is what tends to happen, not as a philosophical reward but as a practical consequence, when a person begins to actually live this way. When you stop spending energy on controlling what you cannot control, something becomes available that was not available before. A kind of presence, a kind of clarity, a kind of capacity to act in the situations that are genuinely yours to act in, with more intention and more awareness than was possible, when your energy was distributed across everything you were trying to manage from a position that was never real. The control you were looking for was never in the outcome. It was never in the other person's response. It was never in the territory outside the boundary Epictetus drew on the first page of his teaching. It was always in your relationship with what arrives, in the space between stimulus and response, in the quality of attention you bring to the moment before the moment, in the examined story rather than the unexamined one, in the felt emotion that has been questioned rather than the commanded emotion that has simply been obeyed. That is where it was. That is where it has always been. And now that you know where to look, the final question is not whether you can find it. It is what you are willing to do consistently and without any guarantee of arrival, to build the kind of inner life where finding it becomes possible more often than not. The practice that has no end. There is no finish line here. And that is the last thing that needs to be said clearly, because without it, everything that came before this moment risks becoming one more version of the same illusion this entire conversation has been examining. One more thing you understood, felt the weight of, and then quietly waited to arrive at, as if understanding were itself a destination. It is not. Awareness is not a level you reach. It is a direction you maintain. And maintaining a direction is a different kind of work than arriving somewhere. It does not reward you with the feeling of completion. It does not offer a moment where you can set down the effort and rest in what you have achieved. It asks instead for something more patient and more honest, the willingness to return every day to the same practice, knowing that yesterday's clarity does not guarantee today's, knowing that the familiar patterns will reassert themselves, knowing that you will sometimes react before you perceive, obey before you examine, follow the story before you question it, and knowing all of that, returning anyway. Marcus Aurelius wrote the Meditations over many years in private, with no intention of publication. They were not a record of someone who had mastered the Stoic practice and was now documenting his achievement for the benefit of others. They were the working notes of someone who was still in the middle of it, who returned again and again to the same principles, not because he kept forgetting them, but because he understood that the principles required daily contact to remain alive in the way they needed to be alive, not as intellectual knowledge, but as operational reality, as something that was actually present in the moment of a reaction, not merely available in the memory of a quieter hour. He wrote in the Meditations, Book 8, Paragraph 7, something that carries a particular kind of honesty. You have seen those things. Look also at these. Do not disturb yourself. Make yourself all simplicity. Does someone do wrong? It is to himself that he does the wrong. Has something happened to you? Well and good. All that happens has been fated from the beginning and spun for your destiny. In fine, life is short, and there is only one thing of value in this present life, to pass it in truth and justice, with benevolence even to liars and the unjust. He was reminding himself, not for the first time, probably not for the last, because the reminding was the practice, not a sign that the practice had failed, but proof that the practice was still alive. What changes over time for the person who stays with this is not that reactions disappear, or that the automatic patterns are fully replaced, or that the gap between stimulus and response becomes so wide that every moment of every day is lived in perfect conscious freedom. That is not what happens. That is not what this is. What changes is smaller and more real than that. The gap begins to appear more frequently, not always, not reliably, but more often than it did before. You begin to notice the thought before you are 3 steps into following it. You begin to recognize the story while it is still forming rather than only after it has already produced its consequences. You begin to feel the emotion and ask, even briefly, what it is telling you rather than simply obeying it as if it were a command with no return address. These are not dramatic transformations. They are quiet ones. They happen in small moments, in conversations that do not become arguments, in reactions that do not become regrets, in decisions that feel afterward genuinely like yours, rather than like outputs from a system you were never quite running. And in those moments, something that deserves to be called presence is actually operating. Not the feeling of control over the world, not the certainty that things will go the way you need them to go, but the genuine experience of being the one who is relating to what is happening, rather than simply being carried by it. That is not the end of anything. It is the beginning of the only kind of freedom that was ever actually available to you. Not freedom from what arrives, freedom in how you meet it. The practice continues, it always will, and the fact that it has no end is not a problem to be solved. It is the nature of something that is genuinely alive. Keep returning. That is enough. That has always been enough.